had it right when he said in 1945 that the United States now stand at the summit of the world. Okay. Chapter 1, Rouen, France, August 17th, 1942. Not a date that's emblazoned in our collective memory like December 7th, 1941 or November 22nd, 1963, or 9/11, but a date that's very, very important historically. Because on that date, August 17th, 1942, the United States began to implement a decision, a policy decision, that had been made about 10 years earlier, about 1932, 33, to build what was then some term we're now familiar with, but it was very novel at the time, to build something called a strategic air force, a strategic bomber fleet. Okay? What happened on August 17, 1942 is that a squadron of exactly 12 B-17 bombers took off from their base in the south of England, flew across the English Channel, dropped their bomb load on a railroad marshalling yard, a switching yard, in the city of Rouen, which is where a few hundred years earlier the British had burned Joan of Arc at the stake. It's a little incidental to this story, but there it is. And they then returned to their base in England, and by the standards that were usually applied to air sorties in World War II, this was a very successful raid. No aircraft were lost, no crew were lost, and all the bombs were dropped on the primary target, which was this railway switching. That's not why this is important. It's important because, as I said a moment ago, we see the implementation here of a war-fighting doctrine that had been decided on the basis of deep deliberation a decade earlier to fight whatever the next war might be or whenever it might happen, to fight it primarily from the air, to build a strategic air arm. Now, one needs to make a distinction here between strategic bombing and what's called in military terms tactical support, tactical ground support. Tactical ground support is usually fighter aircraft or today Apache helicopters or whatever that are used to enhance the combat effectiveness of traditional forces on the ground. Strategic bombing is something altogether different, and its proponents promised a true revolution in military affairs. This was thought to be a way to fight wars in a way that had never been conceived of before, by striking not at the adversary's forces on the ground arrayed for traditional combat, but to leapfrog, overfly them entirely, and deliver your blow against the enemy's civilian heartland, and thus to deprive him of the economic capacity to keep his force, his fighting force, in the field, and not incidentally, to terrorize, that word was very present in the literature about this, to terrorize the enemy's civilian population so that they would lose their will to fight and actually force their governments to throw in the towel. Now, actually, the doctrine of strategic bombing has a very specific origin. In a book published by an Italian military theorist by the name of Giulio Douay in 1922, the English title of it is The Command of the Air. It's thought to be as important to aerial warfare as Alfred Thayer Mahan's The Influence of Sea Power on History was to naval warfare 3 or 4 decades earlier. And Douay, in this book, he wrote it in 1922, he was looking for a way in the future to fight a war that would not repeat the tremendous, futile bloodletting of trench warfare in World War I. Static warfare, where men faced each other in opposing trenches for months on end, killed each other by the tens and hundreds of thousands, with no appreciable effect on advancing the front lines or changing the course of the fighting. He did not want to repeat that, and he was casting around for a different basis on which to fight in a future war. And he said, there's a new technology. It's only a couple of decades old. It's called the airplane. And if we can figure out a way to use the airplane effectively for military purposes, we will revolutionize warfare, and we will spare future combatants the agony of trench warfare and its losses in millions. And the idea was to use the airplane not to support forces on the ground in the field, traditional way, but to overfly the traditional battlefield and strike at the enemy in his heartland, and to accomplish thereby 2 purposes, as I said a minute ago: to so cripple his economic productive capacity and infrastructure he couldn't sustain his force in the field, and so demoralize, or as he said, without apology, to terrorize the civilian population so that they would give up their will to fight. Okay? That decision had been made in the United States in the early 1930s to, whatever the future held, to build the American force around the central component of a strategic air arm. And the design competition was let out in 1933, if I'm not mistaken, and the Boeing Aircraft Company came in with the winning design. That's the B-17 bomber. That's the big workhorse of the European theater. It's later supplemented by the B-24, also deployed in Europe, and eventually the B-29, which is a successor bomber designed specifically for operation at much longer combat radii in the great expanses of the Pacific Ocean. And of course, it's the B-29 that delivers the bomb on Hiroshima and on Nagasaki 3 days later, as we saw in the film. Now, in a delicious, to me, turn of the wheel of history that I did not know when I was writing Freedom from Fear, I learned it later and confirmed its accuracy. It turns out the lead pilot on that raid on Rouen on August 17th, 1942, pilot of the lead airplane was a man by the name of Paul Tibbets. You will recognize the name, some of you. Paul Tibbets is the pilot of the Enola Gay, the B-29 that drops the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima almost exactly 3 years later, 3 years later to the month, in 1945. So, and Paul Tibbets just died within the last 12 to 18 months or so. He was in his 90s, lived in Connecticut. He was also frequently the pilot of Roosevelt's presidential airplane called the Sacred Cow. So he had quite a colorful career. But my point here is simply that in the arc of this one man's military career in World War II, between 1942 and 1945, you can sum up in his biography, as it were, this central component of American strategic doctrine, warfighting doctrine in the war, is to fight to the maximum extent possible from the air, not on the ground, to fight on the basis of strategic bombing, to attack the enemy's civilian territory, not his forces on the ground to the extent possible, and thereby to leverage what were thought to be enormous American advantages in technology, to devise these weapon systems and deploy them effectively, and in production capacity just to make them in sufficient quantity to make this a viable warfighting strategy. There are only two countries in World War II that configured their totality of their armed forces around the central component of the heavy strategic air arm, and they are the United States and Great Britain. The Germans bombed cities, the Japanese bombed cities, the Russians bombed cities, but none of those countries built their air forces on the scale to do strategic bombing on a sustained basis, and they did not make that the central component of their total configuration of forces. So this is a uniquely American way of waging the war. It was also thought to spare American lives. It would not be nearly as costly in terms of human life, American life, as would traditional ground infantry style fighting. So that's chapter 1, okay? Rouen, August 17, 1942, and what it tells us is, of course, the centrality of strategic bombing as the major American investment in its war fighting machine. All right, chapter 2, much more prosaic chapter. Washington, D.C., October 6th, 1942, a meeting in the office of a wartime bureaucrat by the name of Donald Nelson. Donald Nelson had been the CEO of Sears Roebuck Company before the war. He was one of these famous $1-a-year men who came to work in the war effort, bring their executive skills and so on, and take essentially no pay for it, $1 a year, just to be nominally compensated. And Nelson's job, when he took the job on in early 1942, just weeks after Pearl Harbor, was to move the American economy from a civilian to a military basis. Begin shifting resources, gearing up war plants, shutting down domestic automobile manufacturing, for example, and just shifting the whole economy over to a war-fighting basis, going from a civilian to a military event. The military eventually consumes over 40% of GDP in 1943 and 1944, so this effort is enormous. But as 1942 went on, and Nelson, I should say, was in essence implementing a formal document that had been drafted in the War Plans Division of the War Department in 1941 called the Victory Program, capital V, capital P. It is a phenomenally detailed document that lays out exactly what the United States is going to have to make in order to equip its troops and fight the war that it's now engaged in. And it goes right down to the level of stipulating the number of chainsaws, 15,000 sometimes the number, that will be needed to fell the number of trees, to provide the number of board feet of timber, to build the barracks, to house the troops, who will have to be clothed in X number of tons of cotton and wool clothing in order to fire the 40 billion bullets in military combat that they will eventually have to shoot. So I mean, it's just unbelievably detailed. And those were the goals that Nelson was trying to reach, to put the economy on a footing where it could do all that stuff. Okay? As 1942 went on, a group of economists, led especially by a man named Simon Kuznets, who later founded something called the National Bureau of Economic Research, and eventually wins the Nobel Prize in Economics,